Hi, this is Julie Cooper, a mystery and thriller writer, and half of the duo bringing you the podcast, Kendall and Cooper Talk Mysteries. We have a special guest today that we're very excited about interviewing, but first I want to give thoughts and thanks to my brother Chris, who made the original composition, The Man in the Panama Hat, which is our intro and exit music. Thanks again.
Hi, this is Wendy Kendall, and I am a cozy writer, but I love all kinds of mysteries. You know that there are different kinds of thrillers: legal, psychological, conspiracy, action, military. Today we're going to focus on media thrillers. As Adam Labor said, scratch a journalist and you'll find a frustrated thriller writer. He's a British author and foreign correspondent who ended up writing thrillers, most recently Tower of Babel and also The Budapest Protocol, The Geneva Option, and lots more. Today, we're fortunate to talk about the rich history of journalist thrillers and where media thrillers are heading with A.C. Fuller. He's a teacher of both journalism and of writing at such places as NYU, Northwest Indian College, Pacific Northwest Writers Association, and he conducts helpful workshops all over, and he's a great friend. He's also well known in writers' circles with his lively podcast, Writer 2.0. Hi, AC.
Hi, thanks for having me. Thanks for that great introduction.
Our pleasure. And I first met AC at a Pacific Northwest Writers Association conference and then attended one of his programs on a topic near and dear to every writer's heart, procrastination. Yep. And it was a timely and insightful program that focused on some of my truly bad habits as a writer and was immensely helpful to me professionally. So Wendy and I are usually zeroing in on a writer's current work, but this podcast seemed like a great opportunity to grill you as a friend on how you got started with writing and journalism.
Yeah, so I had a kind of start and stop relationship with writing for a long time. I always kind of wrote stuff, thoughts, journals, nonfiction type stuff, ideas for stories, and started writing pretty seriously in my early 20s. But then I had a kid and was working. I worked as a chef back then, and I just kind of didn't have the I would say the steadfastness to stick with it, because we all know it's very hard to get good at writing. And so it takes a long time and a lot of failed attempts for most people. And so then in my early 20s, I decided, well, I'll go to journalism school. That was maybe I was 25 or 24, something like that. And so I went to NYU journalism school, and I thought, well, I'm not going to be a great novelist yet. It's going to take a while, and I may never be, but the best way to do it is just start writing a lot. And journalism, I thought, was a great way to do that. I wanted to explore the world more. I was curious about what was going on in the world, and journalism is a great way to ask people a bunch of questions without them giving you weird looks about it.
True.
So you can just approach people on the street and tell them you're a journalist, or cold call them. And I got to do a lot of interesting things, like go into prisons and, go into strange hotels I would never have gotten into otherwise, and go to political events and stuff like that. That was for me just a way of exploring. And meanwhile, I was still writing a lot, writing some journalism, trying to still write fiction. And so it was kind of a start and stop relationship until about 4 years ago, I want to say now. I think it was it was actually almost right around this time, because it was the morning after Thanksgiving about 4 years ago. I was teaching English part-time, actually full-time at that time. I was teaching English, and my uncle came up to me, my uncle-in-law, my wife's uncle, and he introduced me to his daughter and said, you should talk to AC about writing, because he's a writer. And I didn't think of myself as a writer at the time, because I wasn't writing very seriously. I had sort of lost the drive for it. And then a week after that, I started writing The Anonymous Source, and I decided, okay, I'm in my early 30s. I have the training. I know I can write okay. I'm going to try to write novels no matter what it takes, and not quit this time, and not procrastinate it anymore, and just do it. And I might well fail and I might not, but I'm just going to finish a novel. And so I did that, and then things have proceeded quite well from there. But it was a little bit rocky at sometimes, with lots of start and stops along the way.
So it sounds like it was a combination of both your passion for writing and persistence. But was there anyone who was especially important in influencing your writing career? Maybe a teacher in your formative years or a role model?
Yeah, I had lots of great teachers in high school. There's a woman named Sonia Brooks and Judy Stickney wrote romances under a pseudonym, and she would never tell us her pseudonym, but she was a published romance author. But she taught us English literature. And Sonia Brooks taught us world literature, and we read a lot of African American literature. And I was just exposed to a lot of amazing books, which I think is the best way to get inspired to write, is we read a lot of classics, and that's what inspired me. And I had a great teacher in college named Naomi Schwartz, who's a poet, and she was really encouraging. So I was always encouraged by my teachers. I felt like I was discouraged by society, that writers are not valued in the same way that, say, actors or sports stars are, and they're not usually paid the same way. So and the fact that I had a child kind of pushed me into a more practical thing. I knew I could make a fair amount of money as a chef because I ran my own catering company. And so and then I was teaching at NYU, and that was sort of a job that had some status to it and paid okay. So pursuing writing seriously, it took me getting over my own kind of internal negative talk about it to say, no, I'm going to take this seriously, and I'm going to do this come hell or high water. And doesn't mean I have to, quit my job and live on the street and start neglecting my responsibilities. But I had spent 10 years sort of being encouraged by some people and discouraging myself, I think, from really taking it seriously. And I don't think there's any way to do it if you don't take it really seriously, because unless you're way more talented than most of us are, it just takes a lot of work to get good. And if you don't set aside the time and take it seriously, it's just never going to happen. And that's something I still struggle with all the time, setting aside enough time to keep improving.
Right. And I think that's true of a lot of creative people, whatever your endeavor is. I think we're always much harder on ourselves than certainly friends or family or even agents might be. But
I agree.
I'm always gratified when I go to workshops and conferences to see young teen writers show up at these events. So as a writing teacher and a working writer, what are your top 2 or 3 tips for young writers, or even for new writers of any age, who are just perhaps sticking a toe in the water for the first time and thinking, this is what I want to do. I'm persistent. I'm passionate about writing.
I think I agree. The first time I went to a big writing conference, and I had no idea there were such things on earth. I spent 10 years kind of on my own, not knowing much about the writing or publishing business. And the first time I went and just seeing, you can just talk to agents and well-known authors and ask them about the business and the craft and learn, that was an epiphany for me. So it's great. I agree with you. It's great to see teenagers there sometimes, because it's so fortunate that they get that view of the writing world early on. My tips for them usually have to do with just doing it. Don't stress out about it. Just try to write consistently, taking it seriously. Not, if you want to do it, most of us will sort of we'll talk about it in a way. It's like it's something I'm doing on the side, or it's something I'm doing when I have time, or it's something I'm doing when I'm not doing my job. And for me, it was really important to start thinking of writing as what I'm doing. And that's my job. And I'm treating it like a job, even though I'm not getting paid for it yet. Well, now I am getting paid for it. But at the time, I wasn't getting paid for it. But I still was going to treat it like a job, in the sense that, really in practical ways, my family needed to know, like, these hours we have to treat them like I'm at work, basically, unless the house is on fire. Right. It's just not interruptible. It's not a hobby. It's not like I'm playing video games and you can just come interrupt. Like, this is my work. And then I had to go to my actual job where I got paid money. But my favorite writing book, one that really inspired me, This Year You Write Your Novel, there's something in it. He says something like, "Give your best hours to your writing," which for me is the morning. And I started doing that, and that was very useful. So that would be one tip. Like, really take it seriously, and don't let anyone convince you, or you convince yourself, that it's not your job, and even if you're not getting paid yet. That's my biggest tip. Let's see if I have any others. I don't know. That sort of sums it up. I think everything will flow from there, to take it incredibly seriously. Actually, one other that was really useful for me is, if you're someone who suffers from the potential for self-criticism. A lot of people, they read their first efforts, their first draft, or their first 50 pages or whatever they're working on, and they realize, oh, this is not really great yet. It might be okay, but it's not as good as I would wish it would be. Someone told me when I was writing the first draft of The Anonymous Source, this isn't going to be your best book. Write the best book you can write right now, and you'll get better. And so don't put all the pressure on this one thing. Do your absolute best on this, and you'll have better books in you 2 years, 5 years, 7 years down the road. And that took a little of the pressure off me, because I felt like, okay, I don't have to make this absolutely perfect. My entire life is not defined by this one 350-page book. It's just the start of something. And so that took a little of the pressure off. And for those who feel a lot of pressure to be good at writing, that can be useful.
Good. Very helpful advice. Another question that relates directly to journalism as a profession. We certainly are seeing, I think, the demise of print journalism in favor of electronic media, and the days when the newspaper reporter would rush in and say, "I've got the scoop, hold the presses," or Edward R. Murrow. Right. They're long gone. In fact, a lot of the major newspapers are long gone, sadly. But any thoughts, AC, on what I see as the just incessant blending, the intertwining of journalism with entertainment and commerce? I'm wondering, have we completely lost our objectivity as a reading and media consuming public?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, if not the biggest question of the day, it's one of the biggest questions of the day, because I think no matter what side of this last election we just finished you were on, you certainly noticed that the coverage was much, much different than it had ever been. And if you're on Facebook and things like that, you noticed, a lot of news spreading by memes, false news spreading by memes, and false news on both sides. All sides are guilty of this. Some sides, I think, are better at it. So there's everything from outright fake news to news that is, I would say, inflammatory and not really true, to news that is kind of true. I mean, there's everything in between. So on one hand, there is still a lot of good reporting being done. There actually is good journalism still happening. The problem is that it's not featured as prominently, because if I start an online newspaper called the New York Daily Herald, and I make it look a lot like the New York Times website, a lot of people genuinely don't know the difference between the two. So I can publish any nonsense I want, and it will kind of have the same online in a Facebook feed. It will have the same credibility as the New York Times or whatever, to some people, not to all people, but to enough people
which is kind of terrifying in a way, actually.
It is terrifying. And I mean, on the one hand, this is tricky stuff, because I view it as a colossal failure of the mainstream media, particularly the television media, for the last 15 years has gone so much towards infotainment and not anything like real journalism, that I as a consumer, I want to go to online news. I want to find stuff that's actually doing serious news. And I'm not going to sit and watch a television news show for 4 hours a day, because it's mostly not news. It's mostly just kind of entertainment, like ESPN, or watching a sitcom that has some newsiness to it, but I wouldn't really call it serious news. So on the one hand, like as a consumer, I blame them. But then I call it like the flattening or the democratization of journalism, because anyone can have a Twitter account, anyone can be a videographer now with a phone, and anyone can create a website for almost free that looks as good as the big fancy news sites that have dozens of reporters. It is the big question that I think we are facing as a democracy in the next 10 years. How is this going to get worked out? And we're entering an age where people have multiple sets of facts. I think that's a real problem, is there aren't agreed upon facts anymore. And so you can't have real political discourse when no one agrees on the facts. If you're arguing from two different sets of facts, there's no real conversation possible. And I think 30, 20 years ago, we might have had similar facts to start from, and then people would disagree about how we should do it, and that would be a political discussion. But right now, we are in the Wild West, and I don't know how it's going to come out. My hope is that new, mostly online, major media platforms will develop. Somehow they'll be able to gain credibility, and it won't just be split where everyone's reading their own version of the news. But it's a little bit terrifying, I have to say. And part of the reason I'm writing the novels I'm trying to write is that, the backdrop is the media and news and journalists and all this stuff changing in front of our eyes. So it's a good question. I wish I had a better answer for it.
No, I think you've touched on a lot of things that most of us, especially after this past election cycle, have looked at and said, hey, wait a minute. I'm remembering one of our past presidents who I think used the term truthiness, which is not actually a word, but it's like, how does the consumer judge the truthiness of anything that's out there these days? So that's a subject I'm sure we could go on and on about, but I know Wendy has some questions for you as well.
Yeah, great. I know that the question is so big, and to me it's so fascinating. I'm actually thinking of starting a new podcast just about that issue, to try to interview journalists and media folks and TV folks and online reporters to try to get my brain around what the heck is going on and what's going to happen. Like, is political discourse as we know it pretty much over because of what's happened to news and the media? So it's a big question, but I'm sorry, Wendy, you had questions. I just can't stop talking about this.
Well, now I'm looking forward to your new podcast, so I hope
we'll
that
see if I actually do it. Yeah, I hope I actually do it. I don't know if I'll have the time.
I am too.
Well, I have to wonder, is a journalism background almost a challenging match for writing fiction? How do you reconcile the who, what, when, where, why, how reporter writing with fiction's mystery, deception, obfuscation?
Yeah, that's, I think it is tough for some people. I think it depends. I think some people who from early age read a ton of mysteries and thrillers probably have that like in their bones pretty well, like the natural structure and how you unfold a mystery over the course of, 100,000 words or so. I wouldn't say I have it as innately as some people I know who have, some people read, 2 mysteries a week for 20 years, and I was never that voracious of a mystery reader. So it's a little tricky. I think it's also tricky on the level of writing style. If you come from a journalistic background, most journalists tend to write pretty straightforward, lean prose, trying to be economical about their words, using the fewest number of words possible in most cases to convey something. And so in a novel format, it can be a little bit dry, I would say. And that's something that, I don't know, if I went back and read my book, which I'm actually doing now because I'm going to be re-releasing it, it's a little drier maybe than I would write today. And by dry I just mean like the style is concise. There's not much flourish to it, which I like, and I think that is my style. But I'm writing my new book in first person, which allows me to get a little more texture, a little more personality into it that I'm really enjoying too. So I think that's something journalists have trouble with sometimes is the stylistic element. You're not trying to convey as much information as you can in the fewest number of words in a mystery. You're just not. That's not what you're doing, because you could summarize who killed whom and how. That's a one-page pamphlet. You don't you don't need
book over.
I could even I could do most mysteries, in a sentence or two, and that's not what we're looking for with a mystery. So
Right.
that's what is so great about them, is we get to explore characters and textures and relationships and conversations and details that we never would get to put in a story. But that can be tricky. And on my podcast, I'm always asking authors, like, what is their weakness, and their background often leads to what their weakness in writing is. Like, just they tend to overemphasize one thing and underemphasize another. So and almost everyone has those sorts of problems. And so for me, I would say that's it, is my tendency to want to over communicate and be, a little on the drier side, but I'm working on that.
Well, so as the opposite of this, then, like as a journalist, there'd be a lot of research that goes into it, and a lot of research on the details of what the story is. How do you be careful about that in writing fiction so that you don't overuse the research or over describe the details?
Yeah, that's a good question. Mostly, I have my wife read it, and she cuts out everything that she thinks is boring. And
Nice.
she's a pretty ruthless editor. My style is to write things that move fairly quickly with short chapters and concise chapters. And so whenever she was bored, she would tell me, and she would strongly encourage me to cut stuff out if it got overly detailed. My bigger problem, though, I don't tend to be overly detailed. I think I tend to it's not quite overly detailed. It's like I'll emphasize some things more than others because I'm super interested in them, and they don't end up serving the reader. And so there'll be like kind of chunks that just have to be removed or trimmed quite a bit because they don't serve the main storyline. And then my other tendency is I'll be, because I come from a journalism background where accuracy is the number one rule. I'll over research stuff to make sure that it's accurate. Whereas if you're experiencing a mystery book, it doesn't necessarily matter if something's accurate. It matters if the reader believes it and they're captivated by it. And so sometimes I think I need to figure out what serves the story and what I can sell in the book, and not what is most accurate exactly. Because some readers care about accuracy, but on things that they don't know about, most readers just want to be able to believe and suspend disbelief. So that's something from my reporting background that I think can be time consuming sometimes, to over research something.
That reminds me of the old saying, what's the difference between fiction and real life? And that's that fiction has to be believable.
Right. That's true. Yeah, there's stuff that happens in real life that some things that have happened recently in my own life and probably in a lot of people's perspectives in the world that seem unbelievable and would have been in fiction.
There's some journalist tendencies towards like an insatiable curiosity and also a skepticism. How can you use those kinds of traits in media thrillers?
Yeah, I mean, that to me is one of the great things about writing, and it's definitely one of my tendencies, to be super curious, to not accept first answers or first versions of things, and to want to dig deeper and get more information. So for how I use it in writing my own books is really I just apply that tendency to be curious and to want to dig deeper to whatever I'm researching. And it's fairly simple. I don't want to take the first version of the truth that I find on a web search. I want to keep looking and, find books and find more articles and really get to the bottom of something. And I think the skepticism part of it is useful because in a lot of thrillers and mysteries, and especially the kind I write, there's massive conspiracies going on. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. By conspiracy, I just mean, large crimes that are being covered up, whether they're corporate crimes or within the media or all sorts of things. And to be skeptical about them means just, not taking what you see at face value and actually digging into them. And there's one of the things that I'm researching right now for my current book has to do with the admitted, and the CIA has admitted this, the CIA infiltration of the media that started in the 1930s and 40s to spread propaganda called Operation Mockingbird, which is, it's like established historical fact. There was congressional hearings on it, and it was admitted to, and it's not something most people know about, and it's very complicated. It's not like the CIA controls the media. It's way more subtle and complicated than that. But so this is an example of something that my natural skepticism led me to find out about this, even though it all happened before I was born. And it's just an absolutely fascinating piece of American history that most people have never even heard of. And so I think digging and the skepticism can be really valuable because it can bring you to all sorts of cool stories and cool layers of the world that we miss if we're not digging a little bit deeper.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. That's going to be an interesting read. I'm looking forward to that now.
I can't wait.
I hope so. I hope I can pull it off. It's this first person, media thriller that I'm trying to do, and I'm hoping to finish a draft by the end of the year. That's my target.
That's great. Well, there's a rich history in the old-style news reporter thrillers. One I think of as a model is the Odessa File, which is by the same author as The Day of the Jackal, Frederick Forsyth. This one is a great thrill ride with a young German reporter who's looking for a former SS concentration camp commander. And Forsyth was a reporter for Reuters and BBC. Do you have a journalist that you particularly admire who may have influenced your work a little?
Not particularly. I mean, there's a lot of journalists that are working now who I wouldn't say influenced me, but I admire their work because they're trying to be a voice that cuts through the infotainment kind of news. So like there's the Intercept, Glenn Greenwald and the folks at the Intercept, I think, do good work. There's others, there's good people at various newspapers who are trying to do good reporting, and some of it gets out and some of it doesn't. None of it really is influential on me as writing novels. There were some books that were influential on me writing novels. Like I saw one of the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, for example, was obviously a massive hit about 5 years ago. And people don't necessarily think of that as a journalistic thriller right away. But for me, it was actually inspiring because, the main character, the character most people remember, who is the title character of the book, is structurally not the main character. The main character is the journalist in the book, just from a structural perspective. He's the one who's driving the story in most of the book. And to see that, and part of that book is about the changes in the media that were taking place at the time. So that was an inspiration for me, that just to see, someone has already done a kind of book in the way that I think about the media, which is addressing the changes in the media with a journalist protagonist, and it's been wildly successful. And it has all these other cool elements too, of course, many other elements other than the journalism. But that was one that really got me thinking, this is a thing that can be done in the modern world, and I'm going to try to do it.
Nice. Well, I enjoy your Writer 2.0 podcast very much. And from it, I get a sense of you as a journalist. And I'm impressed with how many interviews you've done. Can you tease us?
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you tease us with sort of an unexpected anecdote or two that you've heard from thriller authors that you've interviewed?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, God, there's so many. One of the cool ones I heard was from the thriller author Steve Berry, who's, I think he's on the board of the International Thriller Writers, and he's a huge best-selling author. He told me, I think it was his first or second book that came out, and he was depressed about it because it hadn't sold very well. And he was at the bar at the Thriller, at some conference or another. This might have even been before the International Thriller Writers. And he told me, I think it was James Patterson, or it might have been John Grisham, like one of the huge names in thriller writers, was sitting next to him at the bar and told him something like, look, some of your books aren't going to sell. Some of them are. Just keep writing and keep going, and don't pay any attention to crummy sales numbers for one book or another. And a few writers have given me that advice, or versions of that advice. And I wish I'd taken it a little bit more, because when my first book came out, I was overly distracted with marketing and the just all the ancillary stuff that comes with having a book out that isn't writing your next book. So I struggled a little with that, but that was very good advice. Let's see. One of my favorite anecdotes was how Robert Dugoni, who writes mysteries and thrillers, his book My Sister's Grave hit the New York Times bestseller list because it was doing so well. And then the New York Times found out that it was published by Thomas and Mercer, which is an Amazon publishing company, and then they took it off the bestseller list after it had already appeared on the bestseller list.
Oh,
and I thought that was a pretty cool anecdote, because I was surprised he was willing to share that on the podcast, because it shows, if you study the New York Times bestseller list, there's various problems with it, but the battle that's going on between Amazon.com and every publishing company and old school media property like the New York Times is a huge battle. And it's mostly behind the scenes, but luckily I get to talk to people like Robert Dugoni who have a little more insider knowledge on it. And so, they say they take it off because they can't verify Amazon's sales numbers, which is nonsense. They can verify Amazon's sales numbers, but they're just in a big fight with Amazon. And so stuff like that I love hearing about, because I know that those fights are going on all the time, but mostly they don't spill out into public. So when they do, I like it because I like to know what's really going on.
So a little intrigue on the Writer 2.0 podcast. People should tune in.
Yeah, that was a while back, but it was an interesting little anecdote. There's so many. There's so many. One of my favorite little inspirational ones was J.A. Jantz, the mystery writer who's hugely successful now, who also got started a little later. She had wanted to write, and she shared all this on the podcast and has talked about it. She had a really terrible, abusive husband who really not only didn't encourage her to write, really almost tried to forbid her from writing, and she had to write in secret at night. Long story short, they divorced. She got very serious about writing, and she told me, and now has gone on to great success with it, she told me she put on her very first computer back in 1985 or something like that, that when you turned on the computer, a little note would pop up on the computer screen that said something like, if you wrote today, you're a writer. And that inspired her to begin the long slog of writing every day and eventually getting published. And now I think she has 50 bestsellers or something like that 30 years later. But she had just an incredibly hard path to get there. And I loved that because it showed the moment where, for her, she just said, no matter what, I'm going to try at this and nothing's going to stop me anymore. And she had to go through a lot more than I did, obviously, with that. But that was an inspiring story that she shared on the podcast, and I know she shared it elsewhere too.
That is inspirational. Well, The Anonymous Source, your first book, I enjoyed so much, with the exciting characters and real intrigue in a media conspiracy. Did some of that story bring back your freelance reporter times?
It did, and I think, I often regret that I don't really regret it, I wouldn't say, but I miss the times I was doing freelance reporting, and I sometimes wish I'd had more of that life, because I had a young daughter and I was able to make way more money at catering. I ended up doing more catering, and then I got hired to teach at NYU in the journalism school, and so I wasn't doing as much actual reporting. So I missed that, and I think writing the books is a way for me to relive that, kind of like live vicariously through my characters.
Nice.
But in the anonymous source, yeah, the main character is a court reporter, and I was never a court reporter, but he starts off as a court reporter in that book. He doesn't end up as a court reporter, but he starts off as a court reporter. And I did a couple times, actually, when I was in journalism school, where I would go to the courtrooms in downtown New York City, and I have to report on cases. So I took all of that straight from my own experience, and of course, I never got into anything like he gets into in the book, but I would say it allows me to draw on the details that I like and the details that I learned, but while also really just taking it anywhere I want to go. I never did anything even near as interesting as the characters in my book do.
Very nice. Well, Julie, what are you thinking about these days when you're writing?
Well, I'm thinking that it's mid-November. We're coming up on Thanksgiving very soon, and the end of the year is fast upon us, which is usually the time when most of us are making those pesky New Year's resolutions or setting goals. And so for writers or people who think about writing, I'm recommending a writing book for anyone who's ever considered writing a novel. And it's one I think that A.C. just mentioned. It's called This Year You Write Your Novel by the highly esteemed Walter Mosley. Now, if you haven't ever read one of his mysteries, you're long overdue. He's the author of 25 books, including the award-winning Easy Rawlins series, featuring one of the very few African-American detectives, and his series is set in Los Angeles. The entire series is well worth checking out, especially one of my favorites, which is the first book in the series, Devil in a Blue Dress. And that book, by the way, was made into a film with Denzel Washington and Don Cheadle. And his book on writing, This Year You Write Your Novel, is a short 103-page, very accessible primer and is filled with wisdom, tips, and practical guidance, along with inspiration and instruction. And I guess sort of to chime in on something that A.C. had said earlier as well, my point would be don't defer your dreams. If you want to write, start writing today. And there are certainly great books out there to help you, teachers, workshops, blogs, Writer 2.0, podcasts, a variety of things that can help you on your writing journey.
And keep reading, too.
Yes.
I'm going to tell you, there's a surprising number of cozy mystery series with news reporters or journalists. Then again, one handy reason is that it's easier for them to hear about, stumble into, or find and subsequently solve mysteries. Some examples include a film critic in the Berger and Maitre series, a 70-something reporter in the Henry O series, an editor and food critic in the Sophie Greenway series. The Alex St. James series is set in a Chicago TV station, and there's the advice column mystery series that J.A. Jantz has with Allison Reynolds in the mystery series, and that features a blogger. And to add an historical cozy mystery, Alyssa Maxwell writes the Gilded Newport Mystery Series with sleuth Emmeline Cross, who is a reporter at the end of the 19th century. So I want to tell you another that I particularly recommend, one that I really love for fun, is the Cozy series by Ellen Byram with Lacey Smithsonian, the fashion reporter sleuth. I also recommend Airtime by Hank Philippi Ryan, with her protagonist, Charlotte McNally, who is a TV reporter in her series. Airtime is the first of 4 novels in the series, and she ends up going bravely and sometimes humorously undercover. All the characters are well written and really come to life on the page. As a counterfeit trail unfolds, Charlie travels from Boston to other American cities. As a reader, you'll be weighing all the clues against the many suspects. Hank Philippi Ryan is an American investigative reporter for the NBC affiliate station for Boston, in addition to being the author. She started in Indianapolis as a political reporter in 1975. She's won 28 Emmy Awards and 12 Edward R. Murrow Awards for her investigative and consumer reporting. Primetime was her first of now many published novels, and it won the Agatha Award in 2007 along with other awards. Her other books have also been multiple award winners, including her thriller books. And she's from humble beginnings. Like so many young girls, she was originally hooked on mysteries with the Nancy Drew series. Julie, do you have a recommendation for us?
I do. I'm going to recommend a classic based on real life, and it's the film All the President's Men, talking about Woodward and Bernstein. Really, I think the one that started it all, or at least one that a lot of people best remember. And it has inspired a host of investigative journalists who either decided to become journalists or perhaps considered writing a novel where the protagonist is an investigative journalist. I'm also thinking of a brilliant film that I saw last year, Spotlight, which starred Michael Keaton, Rachel McAdams, and Liev Schreiber, and a stellar ensemble cast. And again, it is based on a real-life case, the investigative reporting on sexual abuse by Catholic priests in the Boston area. The screenplay is tense and compelling. The characters are driven to relentlessly pursue justice for dozens of young victims, in spite of threats, a veil of secrecy, and insurmountable odds. It's the perfect combination for a thriller. And it's really an edge-of-the-seat film with no lagging moments. I think you can probably find it on Netflix or on demand. So AC, do you have a recommendation, either a book, a film, or a TV show for our listeners?
Yeah, I do, and it's actually kind of a melancholy recommendation. A wonderful thriller writer named Roger Hobbs passed away early last week at the very young age of 28. He had huge breakout success with his first book called Ghost Man, and the sequel was Vanishing Games. These are kind of dark noir thrillers. So if you don't like kind of dark stuff with a criminal as the protagonist, probably don't buy these. His writing style is quite a bit like Lee Child's first-person mystery thrillers. And he was an amazing talent. He sold his first book for a huge amount of money when he was 22 years old, just when he graduated college, and had a meteoric rise to success and had personal issues that ended up doing him in just last week. He was also someone who I interviewed on my podcast, and he and I became friends over the last couple of years. And unfortunately, I had to go to his funeral yesterday. So I don't want to bring this down, though, because I talked to his parents, and they wanted to make sure that I keep talking about his books so people can enjoy the unique talent that he was, really an exceptional talent, the most talented writer I've ever been around. And it's sad to see him go, but his books will be entertaining people for a long time. And I hope the movie, there's rumors that there may be a movie of his first book in the works already. So I would say go check out Ghost Man and Vanishing Games if you like noir thrillers.
Great recommendations, even though it is certainly bittersweet. AC, Thank you so much for your time today. It's been just a complete pleasure hearing more about your writing life, your creative process, and your upcoming next book. And we look forward to seeing more about your next book very soon and keeping in touch through Writer 2.0. Anything else you'd like to add for our listeners?
No, thank you for having me. Great questions. I really appreciate it. And good luck on the continued success of your podcast.
Thanks so much. And for all of our listeners, happy Thanksgiving, keep reading, and keep writing.